Welcome back to Producing Innovation. Today's episode is a special one for me. My guest is none other than Alex Counts, author, social entrepreneur, longtime leader in global poverty reduction, and also, maybe most importantly, my older brother. Alex is the founding CEO of the Grameen Foundation, which he launched alongside Nobel laureate Dr. Yunus, helping take microfinance from a radical idea in rural Bangladesh to a global movement impacting millions of people. He's also the author of several books, including Give Us Credit and Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind. He's a global thought leader on microfinance and poverty reduction, an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins, and a ruthless ping pong player. In this conversation, we talk about innovation where people don't always look for it, poverty reduction, community-based finance, leadership, sustainability. We explore how real change actually happens, why community matters more than individual heroics, and how to pursue meaningful impact without burning yourself out. This episode is about big ideas, hard-earned wisdom, and the long game of doing work that truly matters. So let's get into it. Bro, where do I find you? Where are you today?
I'm at home in Maryland, heading off to Paris tonight.
Awesome. Okay. What's going on in Paris?
So there's a big meeting actually of Grameen leaders, the leaders that I've been working with for several decades, and gathering for the first time without our iconic leader, Mohammed Yunus, who's heading the government in Bangladesh right now, to plot the path forward for the next couple of decades.
Awesome. And he sent you guys all to go get croissants and baguettes?
Something like that. Yep.
Awesome. Well, that's great. And I'm super excited to have you as a guest today. This podcast is about innovation. How is it produced, and how is there innovation in the realm of production? Those are the kind of two meanings that have driven me, both in my career and in this podcast. Listeners, you'll be happy to know that much of my improvement over season one was the result of feedback that my brother gave me, specifically on being a better listener advocate for you all, not being too inside baseball. So I learned a lot about podcasting from my brother, and you've been the beneficiary of that. And when I made the list of people I wanted to bring on for the second season, Alex was high on the list. And because sometimes I think we talk about innovation and we understand it in the realms where innovation is sort of more obvious: tech, business, certain aspects of business. And I think that there are some places where it's overlooked. I mean, my life and career has been a lot about innovation in art, something that I think is very sort of the other side of entrepreneurship is creativity and art. And I'm big fans of people like Rick Rubin, whose recent book, The Creative Act, really talks about how entrepreneurship and art and creativity are one and the same thing. And I wholly agree with that. And I think that there are places where innovation happens where it's less maybe obvious. But my brother has been, just a little bit more on his background. I mean, he's a founder of a global nonprofit, which he founded with Dr. Mohammed Yunus, Nobel laureate, recent interim prime minister of Bangladesh. Alex is a consultant. He's an adjunct professor. He's an author of multiple books. And I think, by many is considered a world leader in the realm of microfinance, partially because of his work with Dr. Yunus, but also what he's done independently of Dr. Yunus over 20 years now, probably 20 years at the Grameen Foundation, and then years since then in other realms, but all pointing in a similar direction of poverty reduction and bringing up the bottom, I don't know, 1 billion, 2 billion, how many people need to be brought out of poverty, bro? But lots, right? And I think that Alex has been applying innovation and really a student of innovation from the beginning. I mean, I think, Alex, I'd love to maybe begin with this story of how you identified Dr. Yunus really before most people knew what microfinance was, before they knew who he was, and what for you made you think like, this is where I want to apply my energy and effort getting out of Cornell as you did. And maybe just tell that story about like, what did you see there? How did that for you represent, innovation or insight or a breakthrough in the things that you cared about? And then what drew you to it? What were your concerns? And give us that a little bit of that backstory that I think sometimes we don't hear. I mean, I know this is drawing you back to like the late 80s, but I'd love to just hear and have you share that story for the benefit of our listeners.
Sure. Well, I'm a big fan of this podcast, and really enjoyed listening to all the prior episodes and the future ones. And it pushed my own thinking about what is innovation, what causes innovation. You know, you've done a lot of yours in the more arts scene. I've done more in the more social justice scene, but I've learned a ton. And I'll go to my backstory, origin story in a second. But I was thinking when you were speaking that on the one hand, I think that most progress in organizations and in society is really based on kind of incremental improvements, process improvements, doing 5% better in whatever you're doing than you did the quarter before or the month before. And I think Muhammad Yunus and I, it's the devil in the details, 3 yards in a cloud of dust. If you're only focused on the breakthrough idea, but then you kind of ignore the devil in the details part of what you're existing working on, it ends up being you're in perpetual pilot mode and kind of visioning mode. So that incremental progress is essential. But at the same time, you need, and I think everyone in their career and every field needs to, from time to time, sit back and say, like, we need to do much better. We need to think outside the box here, to use an overused cliche. And it's been said that, Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb by improving on the candle. So he really we need to think about light in a whole different way. And that's what Muhammad Yunus, when I started to come across his work about addressing poverty, where maybe some people had thought about how you can help, kind of, people that were, you know, middle class, you give them some training, some financing, maybe they hire people that are poor. But the whole idea that you would reinvent banking, so you directly finance the entrepreneurial activities of the world's poor women, would have struck anyone back in the 1970s, almost anyone, as absurd. It's as if you're just imagining giving someone something that they would have absolutely no use for, and like giving a bunch of meat to a vegetarian, like that doesn't compute and is just useless. And so, but Muhammad Yunus had this idea, and it was not an idea that he just came up with sitting in his bathtub brainstorming. He saw the desperate poverty in the villages after he returned from the US, the comfort of teaching at a university in Tennessee after he got his PhD at Vanderbilt. He was teaching economics at a leading university in Bangladesh, but saw a famine ravaging the countryside, including right outside his classroom. And so he said, I need to just go talk with people about what's actually going on, because the economic theories I learned at Vanderbilt don't seem to have much relevance to what I'm seeing outside my classroom. And ultimately, he started testing hypotheses. And one of them was that affordable credit provided in a reliable and dignified way to not the people who could hire the poor, but the poor themselves and poor women themselves, could be the answer. And then once that idea came, and he tested a couple of other ideas before that worked well, but this one was the breakthrough idea that had scalable potential. And so off he went. And then, at the point where he was maybe 8 years into that journey, I started to hear about his work. I was at Cornell. You were in high school. I was in college, and I just became, in the way that you are at that age. Something catches your mind, and you just become obsessed by it. And so I wanted to learn everything about it. There was no internet. There was very little in the Cornell library about his work. There were a few things. His work was just was pretty much not paid attention to outside of certain circles. And so, not knowing any better, I wrote him a letter and told him I wanted to basically dedicate my life to taking his work global, which was kind of an absurd, outlandish, grandiose idea, but it had the kernel of brilliance. And so fortunately, he had the patience to kind of nurture and mentor me so that the kernel of brilliance in that idea could start to germinate into what became my career, which was, at its core, is to take a success story that was already big and later became massive in Bangladesh and say, how do you transfer that to other places at a time where many, many people said, this will only work in Bangladesh. It's just based on unique factors there. And why it wouldn't work in Africa, people had a long list. Why it wouldn't work in India, why it wouldn't work in the United States, why it wouldn't work in South America. And I said, I think differently, but proof is in the pudding, and let me go at it. And so I started organizations, wrote books, wrote papers, I did all the things and then it ended up with a global movement that we now take for granted, that the world's poor women are bankable, and built institutions, wrote a few books, made a ton of mistakes along the way, and made some misjudgments about microfinance that that I've had to live down and learn from. But it's been a good run.
It's being a spectator along this journey has been incredible, really nothing short of incredible, and I think it's inspired me in just so many ways, and offered me insights. And I want to get into the sort of the bigness of it, the global, but I also there's a part of how you approached it that I think for anyone that is, I don't know, there are human lessons in how you approached it and how you went after it. I think that I'd love to just get into some of those quickly. One was getting rejected for a Fulbright, and then kind of persisting and then getting the Fulbright ultimately, learning to speak Bengali, and then making the choice to be there, but not be there as a rich American, but to be there as a colleague of your bank, as the other people working for Dr. Yunus in the bank. And each of those to me is a lesson in and of itself about persistence, grit and rigor, and just humility, and doing something that's really uncomfortable. But I'd love to just, maybe you could just touch those three aspects of how you approached it, because I really think for anyone pursuing anything, there are great lessons in it.
Well, I take a lot. We've our careers. I think we've inspired each other in certain ways. And in one of your earlier episodes, you said if you've got an idea you believe in, you just keep at it, like, until you get it right. And I actually don't totally agree with that. Like, I've had some ideas that whose time hadn't come, and just I needed to let go of. And there is a time and a place for that. But in large respect, I do agree. And there was just something unstoppable about me. I had this idea that I needed to uh, go to Bangladesh, and even if the Fulbright hadn't come through, and at one point I was rejected but put on a waiting list, and then I had a backup plan. I was going to get there, and if you'll, I don't know if I ever told you this, but Dad, who was initially not sold on the idea, our father, when I was a senior at Cornell, he started just sending me like random like $20 bills and $50 bills so I could like build up some money to go airfare. And just his just quiet, and actually when I got the Fulbright, I probably should have given him back the money, but I didn't. And so he was a backer, and and his role. You remember, our father. For those who are listening, he he didn't pressure us to go into his field. He was a physician, but he just said, whatever you do, be the best at what you do. If you want to be a sportscaster, if you want to be an auto mechanic, just like be as best as you can be, and you'll satisfy me. And I think that had more influence on me and maybe you than I realized, because I just said, I want to work in this humanitarian space, but in a kind of at the cutting edge of it, not just, just throw myself into some random job. So the way you do it is you go and you find the best in the world at what you do, and you go there and you find a way to get there. And if Fulbright doesn't work out, you go to plan B, plan C. And if you really want to learn what's going on, not just on the surface, you need to learn a language. Now, I never really did well in languages up to that point in college. It was one of my weaker areas, and yet I just bowled through it and became a very good speaker of Bengali that exists to this day, even though there have been periods where I haven't used it much. And so and I made the point, in fact, in my book, Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind, my kind of midlife memoir, I talk about a very pivotal moment where I arrived at the airport, and there were two delegations to receive me, one from the U.S. Embassy, very nice guys, and they reserved a kind of like a 3-star hotel for me in the diplomatic enclave. And because there's no internet or email or anything, the communications were garbled, but Grameen sent their own delegation, and they talked, and they said, well, who do you want to go with? And I said, I want to go with the Grameen folks, even though it's going to be a much more austere living, because I want to throw myself into a totally Bengali language environment, go native, and really, immerse for the months, a level of discomfort that now that I'm in my 50s, I probably wouldn't do. There's a time and a place for really stretching yourself and like that. And I remember every day during those first months, I just felt totally spent, that I was speaking a language I didn't speak well. I was learning things. I was dealing with, some illnesses that came and went before I built up a good immune system. but I was just so passionate, it didn't really feel like a sacrifice
Mm.
at that time, because I was getting involved with really the leading edge of defeating global poverty. And here I am sitting years later, and people that don't follow it think, oh, global poverty, it's still a big problem. Global poverty has been reduced massively in the last 25 years. Mohammed Yunus isn't the sole player there, and certainly I'm not. But I was able to join a largely successful movement that has made that we can see the ending point to virtually eliminating poverty, especially extreme poverty, from the world. And it was during these critical decades. And microfinance was a real part of that. And I was able to, through hard work and luck and good timing, I was able to put myself in the middle of that, which was a real blessing.
Yeah, no doubt. Just those, your approach to those moments, bro, was really. I don't know. I think I've told you this over the years, but just really, I don't know. It was so impressive to me, especially the way you chose to live in the villages and not go as a a foreign dignitary, but as a worker at the bank, and to do that. And I know that probably opened up opportunities to you that you wouldn't have had otherwise, and visibility that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And you know, my next kind of question is really around what made it work. And let me back up a second. There was a thing that you said once. I remember when you first came back and you were sort of explaining all of it, and you talked about the misperception of people at the kind of lowest rung of the poverty ladder, and that people just assume that they're there because of a lack of pluck, industriousness, whatever. And that you pointed out that those people tend to have, in truth, some of be the most industrious, to be the most willing to take a risk, I mean, really to have some of the things that I think we now think of as like the fundamentals of innovation, the fundamentals of the drivers of success in entrepreneurship and business and things. Let's get into that a little bit. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, but also like what made it work. I mean, the fact that like Grameen and I think microfinance, when it's been well applied, has a higher payback rate than most Western banks, and I just think that that's so impressive, and for many would be very unexpected, but is also very much the reality. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those.
Well, and for your listeners who aren't familiar with microfinance, it basically became a way to, without imposing the requirement of collateral, which basically restricts credit to people that are already have some assets and wealth. It created a way to give loans, often no more than $50 or $100, to the poor women of Bangladesh and then many other countries, to invest in very small businesses that could provide an income stream, whether it's raising chickens, raising a cow, processing rice, things like that, and that can become part of the step ladder to coming out of poverty, with larger loans and bigger businesses happening for many of them slowly over time. One of the things that was very interesting to me is when you'd have a delegation come in from Nigeria or from Arkansas or from Philippines, and they would look to see the women of Bangladesh borrowing their money, small amounts of money, to most people, investing in business, working, and they would, a lot of them would have a reaction to something like this. Well, I can see why this works so well here. The poor women of Bangladesh are entrepreneurial, clearly, and your staff, serve them well, all this, but unfortunately, this will not work in my country. I said, well, why is that? Well, the poor in my country are fundamentally lazy, unskilled, not willing to work, lacking in initiative, all these things. Clearly, that's not the case here, but in my country, it is. And then that you have a group from another country coming in the next week saying the exact same thing. And so everyone has not everyone, but many, many people have a blind spot about the poor people in their country who are their fellow citizens, because you kind of need to tell yourself a story about how poverty in your society is not your fault. it's the fault of the people that are in poverty. And so we develop our myths and half truths that kind of make it easier for us to sleep at night. But slowly people begin to realize that that entrepreneurial kind of grit that they saw in Bangladesh could be unleashed, and in some cases is already being unleashed in their country, but it's invisible to them. They've created a story, a mental model of these people, and they miss things that are outside that frame. And so what Professor Yunus started to do, and sometimes almost exaggerated for the effect of getting people's attention, he said, the poor, if they're alive, by definition, they have highly developed skills. Because in Bangladesh, at that time especially, but even now, Bangladesh has come a long way, and he has a lot to do with that. In a country where there's massive unemployment, there's no social safety net, you have two choices. There aren't enough jobs. You either work for yourself or you starve. And if you starve, if you do that for too long, you're not going to be alive anymore. So the fact that people are still hanging on means that they know how to do a lot with a little. And then if you were to kind of, just like a plant that's surviving with very little water and nutrients, and then you pour in some water and nutrients and fertilizer, it's just going to spring up because somehow it's hardy enough to have survived the poverty of ingredients for life, just enough, but now you put in more. Now you can't put in, just like a plant, if you put in way too much, you'll drown it. But if you kind of measure it and titrate it appropriately, you're going to see a massive growth, and those skills begin to blossom. And so he started calling them survival skills. And then if you capitalize them, and what often happens is, and you can start to apply this to other fields, but let's stick with this for a moment. You get overeducated people coming in here, and you say, oh, this woman is raising chickens and she's doing it very inefficiently and so we need to teach her how to raise chickens better, and so forth. And yeah, maybe there's some process improvements, but in general, it's that tendency of people that are educated to assume that they know better than people that are less educated in almost every domain. And so Professor Yunus said, don't get in their business. They probably know a lot better than you think they know. And if they need to learn something, let them learn it by doing, not by having someone like you come in and teach them. And you might even be teaching them the wrong thing, or the thing that only works when you have 500 chickens, but it doesn't really apply to when you're going from 3 chickens to 10 chickens. So that kind of redefining who a poor person is, who a poor woman is, what her capabilities are, what her needs are, that this fundamental misperception and almost their invisibility. What some people said Professor Yunus did is that there was this invisible market of the world's poor women for credit that just people didn't see. They thought there was no market. And in reality, it was a huge market. And right now it's a very competitive market in places like Bangladesh and Philippines and Kenya and Peru, where a poor woman might have 5 or 6 choices of where to go for credit because people are competing for their business. And that's a whole mindset change. But the core of it, as Professor Yunus said, based on some of his early investigations in the villages, is that these are women with very, very well refined skills, and we're missing them. But if we kind of can providing capital to grow them is the most efficient way to overcome poverty and help people design a better life for themselves. And we don't actually have to do that much except become very efficient providers of credit and very respectful of the skills that up till now we'd missed and ignored.
Incredible. There's an aspect of it that I think really applies to business generally, and it's something that I experienced over the last couple of years, having started a tech company as a spin-off of A-Plan Coaching. The tech company was called Empath AI, and the idea was to apply AI to coaching to make it more scalable, more efficient, sticky, affordable, et cetera. And one of the great opportunities within that for me was becoming a part of an accelerator. And within that accelerator, I had a cohort of a couple dozen other companies, and way more than the kind of knowledge offered to us by the organizers, it was the other entrepreneurs that gave a sense of community and support, and were real. Like the empathy from them mattered so much more to me than the kernels of wisdom, given by the leaders of the accelerator, the VCs who had kind of been there, done that, seen it all, been successful. It was those kind of on my level who were in there fighting it out every day, trying to make their vision a reality. And I know that that's true across entrepreneurship and tech and many other fields. But one thing that always impressed me, and I always sort of understood, but wanted to hear you talk about, was the role of community in these borrowing communities and these lending circles, and how people supported each other, and how they worked. Because it wasn't just like for moral support. It was like your success impacted others, their success impacted you. And there was this, I guess, social pressure associated with that structure. I'd just love to learn more about that, because I think, for a listener who's thinking about doing something, it's like, my advice would be like, find your peers, find people doing something similar, find a community online, find people who are at your stage doing the thing. But here's some science behind it, because this has all been very well established and documented in Grameen. But Alex, please share your experience with it and the thinking behind all that.
Sure. Professor Yunus, there'd been, prior to him starting Grameen Bank, there were various cooperatives that had been started in Bangladesh. What speaking to is to get something right, it almost requires endless tinkering and iteration. So to go back, big vision innovation, but then the tinkering to kind of get it right. And so the cooperatives, it turned out that the groups that they put together, the group was correct, but the groups were too big. And they ignored the social construct they were part of. So the wealthy people in the villages tended to basically dominate those groups, kind of marginalize the poor. Money that was sent to it was siphoned off for them, if they couldn't resist the temptation to steal from it. And so, but that doesn't mean that the group dynamic didn't make sense. But what Professor Yunus said is we need smaller groups, more manageable size groups, and they need to be groups of peers. Rough peers, not exactly, but you put in an influential person in the village with 4 kind of poorer people. The influential person is going to dominate and then kind of redirect. So what Professor Yunus did is he would form what ended up being groups of 5 women who would each would have their own personal business, but the other 4 would almost serve like a board of directors of the businesses of the others. So I'm a group of 5. And so in order to borrow money, I need to get the approval of the other 4 members of my group. And in order to access certain savings, and there are various interlocking responsibilities and expectations to support the others in your group and incentives to doing that. And, Professor Yunus, he sometimes would say these pithy things in both English and Bengali. And one of the things he says is that, people in their individual behaviors are often brilliant, but also erratic. And we all have blind spots. So you can have a brilliant idea, but you just keep tripping up. And one of the things, I became a very good fundraiser over the years. And I sometimes say that fundraising is like 80% intuitive. Like, just treat people well, like follow up. Like when they call you, call them back, like not rocket science, but about 20% of it for any given person is counterintuitive. And if you can't figure out what to you is counterintuitive about fundraising, that your instincts tell you to do X, but you should actually do just the opposite, you're going to fail. You're going to get frustrated. And then you're going to blame external circumstances, and you're going to blame other things, where you actually just needed to have someone to say, Alex, this thing you keep doing, it's not working. You think it's going to work. And that's how it works among these 5 women. So a woman wants to do a certain type of business, and there's a real, that makes sense, except that there's one aspect of how she does it that's kind of self-defeating. And it takes a peer who actually lives in that village, who knows what sells and what doesn't, to just take them aside and said, if you want me to sign off on this loan for $100, after you've paid off the loan for 50, I think it makes sense for you to do your chicken raising business, in this part of the village as opposed to that part of the village. And it's very grounded. It's not based on, high level of education, and it is very credible. And just to give you one example that is not anything about business per se, but one of the women that I studied in a book, I wrote a book about Grameen in addition to my midlife memoir. And as I got to know the women in this village, and I interviewed them off and on for more than 2 years. So, some of the times they only revealed things to me after like a year and a half, because I kind of earned their trust, which is a big part of both business and kind of humanitarian work is really earning people's trust. And so I learned that this woman, although it had ended by then, for many years, including when she was a Grameen borrower for the first while, her husband physically abused her and her kids. He just, domestic violence is a issue that knows no boundaries of class or race or national origin. It's but she was one of the victims of this. And so the women in her group who were actually of a different religion and they a little more experienced borrowers, if you'd asked me if I'd known about it, I would have, let's say, given the husband a lecture, and I would have said, that's a bad thing you're doing. And I don't respect, when he would have said, like, who cares? But the women, neighboring village, they took the woman aside and they said, here's what you should do. He said, I see that your husband enjoys, he uses part of your loan money for his business and you use part of the loan money for your own business. So he's kind of dependent upon you for capital for his business. So here's what you do. You tell him that Grameen has a very strict rule that if any borrower is subject to any violence from a family member, they are immediately cut off from loans, like, the next day, which actually isn't the truth. I mean, it might happen in some cases, but it's not a law. But they were brainstorming, how do you get inside this husband's head? How do you convince him that it's in his interest to stop abusing her? And they thought of the brilliant strategy that made sense for that village and which again, as an outsider, I would have never thought of that. So she took this idea, dropped this thing to her husband in some way, and then he immediately reformed his behavior. And so that type of solidarity from people who really know what's going on, that you create incentives for that was the whole brilliance. But also it didn't go into the area of this wasn't these weren't businesses run by committee. Each one had their own business, so private enterprise and having that autonomy to run your business, but you're accountable to people who are peers and who have incentives to help you. And that, and once they got that model right, it just worked wonders. And, today it's a profitable bank serving 9 million women across the country. It is 75% owned by the women who borrow from it. And it served as a model that revolutionized global banking, such that many global banks that like Citibank and all, they have microfinance wings now that that they're trying to figure out how to leverage the insights that came out of originally a single village in Bangladesh and then over time grew. And that group is like individual enterprise, but within a group product. And so when you talk about your accelerator, it's kind of that same lesson. People that are peers on some level, might even be competitors theoretically, but that, just kind of see that if they work in solidarity with one another, you can just amplify learning and achievement in ways that operating on your own, again, you're talented, but erratic, and you don't know when you're erratic, but your peers can sometimes tell you, and then you can just kind of straighten out and be more consistent and get where you want to go.
Such a great lesson. And I've never heard that story, but that's just brilliant and inspiring. I guess we could go so deep here, and I want to kind of jump forward a bit though, and have this sort of maybe final third of our discussion today, bro, about the memoir and what you learned sort of over the course and how you're applying that now. And specifically, my brother's recent book is How to Change the World Without Losing Your Mind. And this aligns with a lot of the later work that I've done in my career around coaching and A Plan. Its mission is coaching for change makers. And we try and be a resource and support for people that are having a positive impact. That could be, we kind of define it broadly, but the idea is people that are bringing about positive change in the world, and how do we support them and how do we help them be successful. And my brother's book was, I think, pointing in a similar direction, with the idea that a lot of mission-driven work in the fields, often in mission-driven organizations and companies, there is a tendency to sacrifice oneself. And I feel like I've done it myself, in the limited ways that I've been in the realm of social impact. It's like the mission is so important that I'll burn out, I'll work for less, I'll go further, I'll go above and beyond. And that's fine for a time, but over the long term, that's not a sustainable strategy, and that people burn out. And some of the people with the most potential to give and impact others burn out and kind of destroy themselves in the process. And you give in your book a few examples of that are really kind of opening and kind of heartbreaking in their way. And just love for you to talk about that a bit, and sort of what you've learned. I know we can't go through the whole book. I encourage people. I'll put the book in the show notes so people can check it out. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. Lots of great insights. But at a high level, like, what do you see, and what have been the big takeaways for you from a 30-year career in social impact?
Yeah, you did something with Dad, with our father, towards the end of his life. We were talking about it recently, where you interviewed him about his life, and then I actually wrote in the book. I wrote that in the book, and then I wrote that those tapes were lost, and then we've recently found that those tapes were found, which is wonderful. The thing I took away from that, you've told the story, is that here you have someone who is a psychiatrist who'd examined his own life on some level, but just telling his life story to another human being, it took all of these things that were jumbling around in his head, and by expressing them to another human being, he began to see themes and trends and insights about his own life that he hadn't had before, despite all of his training. And that got me thinking. And then I sat literally in this room in 2013, so 13 years ago, and I began to write my midlife memoir. And part of it was, whether it's telling another person, working with a coach, or writing, that processing of things that you are, and trying to make sense of your life, your mistakes, your achievements, your insights, the things you've never been able to understand. All of that in a format, in certain formats, just leads to new insights about yourself, and then open up new possibilities. So one of the things that I learned, that that I don't, in the writing of it. Well, first of all, I just learned how important the last third of the book is about taking care of yourself, is about not burning yourself out, which early in my career, I was one of those nonprofit folks, just like you were saying, where you almost wore as a badge of honor how much you abused yourself. So you'd be sitting around with other nonprofit leaders, and you say, well, I haven't taken a vacation in a year. Well, I haven't taken a vacation in 2 years. Well, and you'd almost brag, and that culture I think, is very corrosive. And I've known people and I tell in the opening pages of the book, a nonprofit leader who, having achieved a ton and who I admired, killed himself very shortly after I met him for the first time, presumably because he for whatever reason, because he just despaired despite all that he accomplished. And I think it's that culture in the nonprofit where sacrifice is not something you minimize, it's almost something you maximize. And so one of the lessons that came out of this writing process, and it became much more ingrained in who I was, is I just realized that in nonprofit work, where most of the time you have more to do than you can do, and fewer resources than you need. And you just need to make your peace with the idea that in nonprofit work and others work, good is often good enough. And sometimes it's not. And so which is to say that if you treat everything needs to be great, you're going to burn yourself and the people around you out. And I did that early in my career. And then you start to realize, no, actually, a lot of things can be just good. And then, because you want to save the resources, because a few projects a year or a few weeks a year, things need to be great. And then wisdom is getting better and better at figuring out what are those things where good is good enough, and what are those things that need to be great, and conserving your energy for those things that need to be great, and then just getting more done, because when your standard is good, you might be able to get 20 things done as opposed to 12. And a lot of times nonprofit work demands that. And so that making the peace, mediocrity is not something that I'll ever really feel good about myself or people around me, but something less than great is often what makes sense. And so and in that way, I then was able to be much gentler with myself, and with still having high standards, but not standards that would drive me to ill health, to not really investing in my relationships and my well-being and my spiritual and physical and mental health like I should. And so surprisingly, but distilling these kind of insights, some of which ended up becoming kind of pithy, my own little mantras. Like another one I would often say to people when I was leading a group, facilitating a meeting, I would say, I want all of you to boldly speak your truth, but not to confuse it with the truth. And that was just the whole writing of that. How do I write about this thing that I kind of understand on some level? And then I just figured out that was a pithy way to express something that I'd learned in the process of learning. And the writing of it down, or speaking of it to a coach, or speaking to a close friend or relative, oftentimes just solidifies and clarifies something. And then you have that becomes a base for more self-understanding and ultimately more achievement and more satisfaction.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with that more. And I too, in a different field, but wore that badge of overwork and burnout in the realm of like art and theater, where I was working in the nonprofit art space in my 20s. It was like we like mocked, the kind of the normie things that people did and worried about, and we just said like we sacrifice everything for our art. There are so many ways. I mean, I've seen it in tech. I've seen it at the highest levels. In Silicon Valley and
Academia, government, corporate.
absolutely. And actually, and in addition to that, one that I mean that you can't. I mean, some people say, "Oh, it's a marathon or a sprint." I've had people say, "Well, it is both." It's like, nope, you die trying to sprint 26 miles. Um, and and so like sustainability, health, filling yourself up, taking time, rest. I mean, I think people before didn't even understand what a pillar of health rest is, and getting 8 hours sleep a night. And I think there are times in many industries where people like mock that, laugh at that, and I just think that that's so short sighted. And then I just say quickly that one of the biggest things that I've learned, and I've heard this now, being in accelerators, working with lots of venture capital firms and other very successful tech entrepreneurs, this idea of focusing on the right things. And it's like, what are the things that need to be great? What are the things that need to be good or can be just good? And what are the things that just aren't even worth your attention, that we sometimes get fixated on because they feel good, or they, to complete something that gives you a sense of accomplishment in a day may feel good. You can check the box. Other people may see you complete something, but if it's the wrong use of your time, effort, energy, it's actually self-defeating. And I think that that's something that applies to tech and entrepreneurship, and not just nonprofit and mission driven companies and organizations, and just figuring that out for yourself. I think anyone listening, whatever you're going after, know that kind of planning and consideration of what are you going to do, what is yours to do, how can you delegate, how can you allow others to do things, to succeed. Sometimes it's talked about, especially in coaching circles, like what's your zone of genius, what's your zone of excellence, what's your zone of competence, what's your zone of incompetence, and what should you allocate to each of those domains for yourself based upon your role and your skills and talents and so forth. But yeah, there's so many good insights. I really, everyone listening, I really encourage you to check out Alex's book, How to Change the World Without Losing Your Mind. And what about the other one, the kind of the companion book to
Yeah.
that?
So you've slightly titled it. So it's called Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind.
Right.
And so if people just that first word, but I wrote, I often joke that I have many faults and flaws as a human being, but writer's block is not one of them. And when I set off to write this book in 2013, when I took a picture of a blank screen and I just said, here we start. I ultimately wrote 800 pages. And I had a terrific editor who got it down to about 300 pages, Changing the World Without Losing Your Mind. But of the other 500, some were junk. I mean, some were just like meaningful to me, but really didn't belong in a book. But there were times where I would get stuck writing stories about things that I learned, and I just started writing down lessons that I learned, usually in maybe 2 sentences, like just some success strategy that I had learned over the course of my career. And then I would go back to writing stories. And so at one point, most of those little just, those discrete standalone lessons did not make it into Changing the World. A few did at the end. And then so I had about 400 of them listed. And at one point I was just going to just write them up just to circulate privately as a document that I would, but my publisher was looking to get more books into print, and he knew I really liked this, so he said, let's turn that into a book. And so we consolidated 400 lessons to about 214, combined some, throughout some that weren't that good, expanded on them a little bit, so each of them about expressed in about 4 sentences. And that book, while it doesn't sell as much as Changing the World, I find that some of the people who buy it, it's like so heavily underlined, and it's just very practical and very pragmatic in a way, because I strip out all the stories of how I learned these things, and I just tell you what I learned, that in domains, whether it's management or building a board or fundraising or leading a group, facilitating a meeting, taking care of yourself, even something I learned a lot about, which is how to travel in a way that doesn't really wear and tear on you, like little tricks that you can do to have travel be less of an issue that impacts your well-being. And so that book, and it's a book that if you read it straight through, a lot of people don't read it that way. But if they do, it literally can be done, begin and end it in 90 minutes. But it has literally, of all the most important things I learned in my life and career, that if I had 90 minutes to sit down with a 29-year-old version of myself who was about to go into his first big leadership thing, I'd say, that's what I would do. I would just say, I don't have time to tell you the why and the how, but just here are some things you should really bear in mind. And, you'll learn them, but you should learn them faster. It'll be good for you. So that became the kind of the spin-off book to Changing the World. It's, it's one point, because there were so many lessons, we thought like we'd make it a calendar, one lesson per day, but it turned out there were only about 200 and plus lessons that were really worthwhile to publish, and yet that has its own audience too. And the title is "When in Doubt, Ask for More," which is the title of one of the 214 lessons, and it's another book that I'm proud of.
Awesome. Yeah, there are lots of great lessons. I've picked that up many times and just flipped it open to read something that is a lesson, an insight, and many of them I find a space in what I do. Last question, and we can do it quick, bro. Many listeners know from other things that I've said about my story and things we've talked about on the podcast before and things that I share on social media. Coaching has been a huge part of my life. 9 years ago, I started a business to pursue that, and Alex and I work together on that, which has been really fun. And we have 80 coaches. We coach at companies around the world. We coach at some really wonderful blue chip companies like the Obama Foundation, their leadership program around the world. And coaching is I just think it's such a critical resource. And my brother is the one who introduced me to that almost 25 years ago. And it had such a huge impact on my life. What is it, bro, to you? Why is coaching so impactful?
Well, I think there are basically two types of coaching. I'm a fan of both kinds. One is a kind of a technical coaching. So I know a lot about fundraising. So if you were running a nonprofit and fundraising, I could probably look at your fundraising program and tell you 7 things you could do to improve fundraising, and probably 5 of them would work and 2 of them might not, right? And that's you could say it's consulting, advising. But the kind that A Plan does, and that I'm a big fan of, is a kind of more of a Socratic method, where the coach is really a facilitator to bring out the coachee's best thinking and brilliance, and to kind of uncover that in a certain way. I'd never thought of it before. It's almost like the loan officer of Grameen using the tool of credit to bring out the brilliance of the microloan borrower in Bangladesh, going at it kind of almost a minimalistic way, like not telling the woman you should raise your chickens this way, but just, I trust you, here's a credit, and I think you can handle it. And a coach that coaches in the kind of the A Plan model that I've used off and on really since the late 90s is someone that, I can, in a way that's different from, comparable to how the insights I got from writing about my life, is speaking about someone with a certain skills that can, that can uncover trends, that can point me in directions, that can prompt me to think about things in a new way. And I just think it's such a worthwhile process to just kind of deal with one's blind spots, to do a better job at celebrating one's victories, leveraging one's strengths, addressing your weaknesses. It's something to do in a conversation with someone that's skilled, but not telling you what to do, but is skilled in bringing out the best in you. And I'm a big fan. I try to convince people to get a coach, that kind of a coach, and wherever possible through A Plan. And I pay for an A Plan coach out of my own pocket and happily do so, because it's just such a gift, and it just allows me to be the best person, best husband, best entrepreneur, best innovator, best writer that I can be, and to have more fun doing it. And brother. Yeah.
Awesome. Where can people, if they'd like to check out your books, bro, where can they find them?
They're on Amazon. Some people don't like Amazon. You can buy it direct from my publisher, Rivertowns Books, and their volume discounts you can get barnesandnoble.com and other places. Independent bookstores get them through a company called Ingram. And so if you believe in your local bookstore, probably don't have it in stock. A few large ones do, but really you call and ask them for it, and they'll order it through Ingram, and it'll be there in a couple days. So there's lots of ways, and of course getting it as an ebook. And I hope that people read it. I hope they publish reviews of it online. I hope they let me know what they thought of it. I hope you publish a review of When in Doubt, Ask for More, given that it's been meaningful for you on some online platform to help get some buzz about it. I hope people be in touch with me. alexcounts.com. I don't give a secret of how to get in touch with me. I love to hear from people who want to be in touch.
30 years in, bro. Keep up the good work. You're an inspiration and an awesome brother. So thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.